Nobody goes to Amazon, clicks buy, and then sends Amazon a check a week later or 2 weeks later. Having embedded payments right where you're doing your work, right? So you can stop having to do the swivel chair. So data can be, auditable, put right back into the system that you actually care about is, really key.
I'm Austin Prey, Senior Reporter here at Payments. Joining me today is Chris Wyatt, the Chief Strategy Officer at Finexio. Thanks for joining me today, Chris.
Thanks for having me back. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to see you again. And it's another exciting conversation. We're here to talk about embedded B2B payments as, the next frontier in accounts payable digitization. And it's kind of today's finance leaders, to dive kind of right into this topic. They face unprecedented demands to do more with less, to stay agile amid economic uncertainty, and to drive business model, kind of at every step along the way. Kind of given these needs, where do you think the biggest usability gaps still exist today, across accounts payable workflows?
What we see most often is the biggest gaps are actually in between the workflows, in between the systems that people, and companies are using. We often see, in fact, we were just a, customer the other week, and they do this swivel chair thing where they have their AP automation software, whatever that is, does a pretty good job of so that front end, let's process invoices, automate them, digitize them, get approvals. But then what happens once everything's approved and it's time to pay? Well, typically that's the swivel bit of the chair. You go log into a bank portal or another system, or in some cases, this customer we were at was quite literally hitting print and going over to the printer, grabbing those checks off the printer and stuffing them in the envelope. So, I think what we really see is this sort of this disconnected, kitchen, if you will, right? Where everything's sort of in different places, and ideally it all just be sort of on that nice kitchen island that you had, and sort of one nice place. But yeah, I think that's the biggest gap that we see is sort of this just having to use multiple tools and then having to really just, manage it. It becomes a lot to manage for these AP teams.
Awesome. Yeah, no, and I love that. Just, I guess, to take that metaphor, to stay in it, kind of when it comes to the mise en place of businesses and their kind of, B2B payments, there a lot of leaders are coming to expect the same seamless experiences that they get, consumer apps and kind of, the context of their daily life when they're getting coffee, on the way to work. Are finance teams coming to view, solutions like embedded B2B payments as, more of an essential kind of strategic transformation and kind of, relative to the maybe nice to have it kind of was in the early days?
Yeah, I guess the short answer is yes. And it's been an evolution, right? So, for Finexio, which now has been around 10 years, it's hard to believe. I think when we first went into market, it would probably be considered more of a nice to have. Whereas now I think it is becoming more of that sort of, essential part of your strategic transformation, because I think we'll talk more about probably, office of the CFO, AP teams, sort of how they're providing more value. But, for us, what we've seen is, and I think you touched on it, we're all used to the consumerization, right? Nobody goes to Amazon, clicks buy, and then sends Amazon a check, a week later or 2 weeks later. That's just, it's just not a thing. So I think yes is a short answer, where, having embedded payments right where you're doing your work, right? So you can stop having to do the swivel chair. So data can be, auditable, put right back into the system that you actually care about is, really key. It's almost like, it would be like almost like saying, hey, is having GPS a nice to have, or is it essential? I think most people would say probably today it's probably essential. Yeah, you could go back to having a map, but why when you've got the all these nice tools available? So yeah, I think it's really incumbent and almost this, more and more essential to more and more organizations, I guess is the best way to think about it.
Yeah, totally. When it comes to businesses that maybe they're still even getting out of their swivel chair, they're turning around in the chair and then they're still getting up. What are some competitive risks about kind of continuing on with some of those methods with ACHs, wires through through a fax machine? There are still some entrenched but predictable kind of payment methods. Are there any kind of predictable competitive risks that are also coming along with these methods?
For sure. And I won't even talk about AI, at least not now. But so the example I gave earlier of this, customer we were at, where they're quite literally printing checks off the printer and putting them in the mail. I mean, I think we all know that's expensive. Don't know if you guys noticed, but postage went up in July. So, stamp, I think, is close to 80 cents now. So that alone starts to add up. And then it's just slow, right? If you're having to manually do all this work that can now easily be automated, simplified, electronified, if you will, it tends to be very manual and repetitive. And then that leads you into another potential problem, right? So potential errors, just because you're sort of turning that crank and whoops, you made a small mistake, added a zero or forgot a zero or a decimal point, whatever the case may be. But I think really the biggest thing that we've seen is ripe for fraud, right? Machines aren't very susceptible to being convinced that you are who you say you are or you aren't, as an example. But humans, are vulnerable, and a lot of times humans have a bias towards like, yeah, I think I know this supplier. I've talked to them every day. But are you really talking to them? So I think that's one of the biggest things that we see. And certainly as it relates, if we're going to talk about manual processes, like paper checks, still the number one vector for B2B payments fraud from a quantity standpoint, not so much from a dollar standpoint, just because there's less dollars going in on checks, but it's still very prevalent. And then even working with these digital methods, if you're having to do that swivel chair thing and go over, log onto your bank and do a few things, again, slow, expensive, manual, and definitely open to more fraud.
Yeah, I know those are all really kind of just great points to point out and great things to flag across the landscape. And, some joint research between payments and Finexio, it shows that 62% of businesses, cite ERP integration as a top factor when selecting an accounts payable solution. How can firms, do this? Kind of what's behind this sentiment? How can firms ensure that embedded payment solutions, align with their various ERP and procurement systems to kind of, just support the core of their business operations?
Yeah, I think one thing it comes down to is not sort of a traditional sort of monolithic integration. We get this question all the time. Well, do you integrate to ABC? And that's fine, but a lot of people don't even know what they're really asking when they say integrate, because if integration, APIs, passing files, there's any number of ways to quote unquote integrate. And ultimately, it's like, what does that user experience look like? But more importantly, I really think the goal should be more about having this flexible sort of payment fabric, if you will, that can ideally connect to almost any system and really be able to process, manage payments, the best way that, a buyer wants to send payments and a supplier wants to accept payments. So I think it's less about having those point-to-point integrations that we see a lot. And more about how do you create a simple, holistic solution that just does it all for you, right? Think of it about as the easy button. And this is a lot of times what we discover with some of our customers is they have multiple processes. We work with one major higher ed institution that you would recognize by name. They quite literally mailing checks to themselves and cashing them so that then that team can then go send an ACH. So I think the more you can drive towards, sort of think of it like a universal power adapter if you're traveling, right? You don't necessarily want to have to worry what country you're in. You just know that it's got what you need. So I think the more companies start to think like that and find solutions that sort of support that notion, the better off they're going to be.
Yeah, and I think that's incredibly well put. And it's, it used to be, I guess, staggering kind of the size of the complexity of the problem of these payments, but the technology is now there, and so we're at a really great point, within kind of the B2B payments landscape, and to kind of going along with what you've been saying, there's a distinction between the front end of embedded payments and kind of the back end of accounts payable as a service. How crucial is this managed service infrastructure to delivering an effective embedded payment experience?
I might be biased, but I'd say it's everything. It's not just crucial, because for the most part, the front end, that's the user experience, and that's great. But ideally, if you're really going to help these, AP team save time, energy, money, resources, let them do something better, it's already easy. They just want to know that the bills are getting paid. So what does that mean? Well, then the back end service has to really do all the heavy lifting. So ideally, the AP teams aren't worrying about how everybody gets paid. Hey, did I enroll this supplier? Did I run them through KYC checks and compliance? Am I good there? And then what happens if there's an exception, and I have to reconcile these payments? Like, does all that happen on the front end or on the back end? And ideally, if you're working with like payments as a service provider, it's all happening in the back end. You don't really have to worry about it. You know what's happening. You can see the results, but it's almost like you want to order something at the restaurant. Comes, eventually, the chefs are doing something, and it comes out later on. You see the result. You see the end result. So, for us, we definitely think that's the right way to go. It removes a lot of the complexity without reducing transparency, right? And so I think if you can sort of take that burden that typically is manual, low value, repetitive work, automate it, do it very well, very safely, and still provide the transparency, then I think you've sort of got the best of both worlds. So yeah, I would say from our standpoint, having a good user experience is certainly important. So I mean, we stress, from transparency and just making sure it's easy to understand and use. But ultimately, it's the back end processes that really, that's where the engine is. That's where all the heavy lifting happens.
Awesome. Yeah. And I love the call out of kind of, removing the complexity, adding transparency. But kind of, the best part is that it doesn't stop there. Once you've gotten rid of the complexity and you have the transparency, there are more and more opportunities to monetize, kind of through these, value-added services across embedded B2B solutions. How can organizations explore or capture new revenue streams from embedded payments, whether through virtual cards, dynamic discounting, or other value-added services?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with the inverse, because this is something we stress a lot, is cost avoidance. So again, think about those manual, repetitive tasks that are expensive for your team. And ideally, it's probably not what you hired your team to do. They could be more strategic. They could really help manage vendors and suppliers more effectively. But when they're stuck, on a Friday, grabbing pieces of paper off the printer and, stuffing those chucks in envelopes, that's not a very, efficient way to use them. So there's certainly this cost avoidance, and that's something we always like to stress. But then, yeah, from there, virtual card, think cash back, right? This is something that is so ubiquitous in the consumer realm. We've all got our card that gives us points, cash back, whatever it is. It's highly underutilized in the B2B space, and it's very much a real thing. And that doesn't mean you're going to use, a card or a virtual card for all of your payments, just like you're probably not using your card personally for all of your payments. But it is a great way to earn something, cash back, and potentially actually take that, what was AP cost center, potentially turn it into a profit center, which is super interesting. And we see a lot of customers, being able to do that. And then you start to open up other avenues of, I think you mentioned like dynamic discounting, supply chain finance. Really, for us, we want to empower the buyers more because they're the ones with the money. They're the ones making the purchasing. They've got the purchase decision. And in many cases, the suppliers are willing to negotiate, right? Okay, I'll take a card today versus waiting, 90 days for a check. So there's a lot of different sort of levers you can pull to drive value above and beyond just, simply, hey, we'll give you cash back, because that certainly is a thing. But I think it definitely goes deeper than that for most organizations that are doing it right.
Totally. And, looking ahead, kind of how do you see embedded B2B payments, shaping supplier relationships and broader ecosystem partnerships kind of over the next 5 years? And also, kind of what is the impact, these benefits might have on the office of the CFO and just kind of, the finance team more broadly?
Yeah, I'll take it in two parts. I think there's like the practical, like what do we definitely see happening, and then we'll talk about what do we think is coming. So I think things are going to go from sort of transactional and reactive to, I think, much more collaborative and predictive. Right? There's always been this notion that, hey, I'm going to get a bunch of calls from my supplier. They're going to ask me where the money is or what happened. I think you're going to see a lot more transparency, and that is just from better technology, better tools. This can be self-service portals. And ultimately, this could be something that, lands on a ledger, lands on a blockchain that is immutable. And, technically anybody could have, access to it. So there's going to be technology plays that really, I think, create a transparency level that doesn't exist today. And it doesn't mean you're going to be sharing all your information, just to be clear. But I think you'll have the transparency sort of when and where you need it, which I think is going to be super interesting. I think there's going to be more financial flexibility as a service, because we touched on finance, supply chain finance, leveraging cards. I think that's going to become much more of a common sort of toolkit where you can, decide how you want to pay, have several ways you can pay and or finance, your invoices, whatever the case may be. And then we're going to see more like ecosystem effects, right? There's going to be more of these interconnected systems, and that's just, I think, inevitable. Things have been very siloed, for various reasons, but now all this is getting connected as it becomes more and more electronic. And so I think you'll see more sort of ecosystem plays that will be, I think, super interesting. And then last but not least, I do think you're going to see the rise of agentic payables. And it's going to be really interesting to see how much, LLMs, some of that technology really comes into play. And I think acts more as a, helper versus somebody like, replacing, jobs. But there's going to be a lot of interesting technology that, comes out, I think, well, certainly within 3 to 5 years. But that'll be fascinating to see sort of how that interplays with sort of the existing AP world.
Yeah, I mean, we got to have you back on. I think each of those could be their own, very fascinating discussion.
Yeah.
But Chris, thank you so much for your time today. Great predictions, great conversation as always, and just can't thank you enough.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks, guys. We'll talk again.
Awesome.